the Philippines today, LGBTIQA+ people and the issues they face have become more and more prominent in the mainstream public consciousness. With the prominence of Catholic cultural practices and values due to the long Spanish colonial rule, it is perhaps assumed that tolerance and acceptance of sexual and gender diversity is the result of more modern American cultural influence on the country. And yet, this assumption does not take into account the fact that sexually diverse and gender-non-normative individuals have been part of Philippine history not just for the past 2 or 3 decades, but for centuries, even during pre-colonial times. What does it really mean to be a tomboy? To be a bakla? What are the lived experiences of the Filipino lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender person? How do they fit in and stand out within the colorful tapestry of Philippine life? More tomboy, more bakla than we admit. Insights into sexual and gender diversity in Philippine culture, history, and politics is part of a series of scholarly anthologies under Vibal Foundation's Academica Filipina imprint, which also includes More Hispanic Than We Admit, More Pinay Than We Admit, More Chinoy Than We Admit, and More Islamic Than We Admit. Each book in this series gathers scholars and experts in a multitude of fields: history, politics, economy, art, literature, sociology, popular culture, and more, to examine aspects of the Filipino that are often overlooked or not given much scrutiny. More Tomboy, More Bakla Than We Admit, edited by Mark Glacius and Richard Chu, endeavors to explore the diversity of sexual and gender identities within Philippine culture and history and the unique circumstances that LGBTIQA+ individuals experience.
My name is Mark Glacius. I'm a professor emeritus of political science at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, which is the public university of New York City. I've taught at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, which is how I became acquainted with Vibal and with Vibal Publishing and Gus Vibal. And I met Gus, and he asked me if I would edit this book. Because I guess he read some of my own books, I published already about 4 books. I've edited 2 books on sort of political philosophy and LGBT politics. He invited me to be the editor.
I am Richard Chu. I'm currently a faculty in the History Department at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I am also the co-editor of the anthology More Tomboy, More Bakla Than We Admit. We wanted the essays in the anthology to be as widely representative of the LGBTIA+ community in the Philippines. So we wanted to make sure that there is an essay covering or pertaining to the bakla in the Philippines, an essay that would pertain to transgender individuals, or an essay that would also pertain to lesbians or tomboys. So we wanted to make sure that everybody in the community is represented.
There were very few people writing about LGBT in the Philippines. A lot of those peoples were looking in from the West, from outside the Philippines. A lot of those people, few that there were writing from the diaspora, but very few people who lived in the Philippines, who identified themselves as gay or lesbian or trans, writing about their experience, writing about the history of their culture, LGBT culture, and the contribution of LGBT people to Philippine society and culture. So I wanted to encourage more people to write about that in the Philippines. By writing, it would help them get jobs teaching. And by teaching, they would kind of grow the field and grow consciousness about sexual diversity and gender diversity and change Philippine society.
We were hoping and we would like to include scholars who are Filipinos or Filipinx American at the or the Filipino in diaspora. So we try to make sure, if we could, find works written by Filipinos themselves.
The first section of the book sets up the theoretical and historical perspectives that will guide the reader through the rest of the essays. For the opening essay, Neil Garcia revisits his iconic study on Philippine gay culture, while giving a broad and theoretical analysis and bringing up epistemological and ideological questions for studies of gays, lesbians, and transgender persons in the Philippines. He points to the importance of a post-colonial perspective, one that specifically includes the struggles of LGBTQIA+ people within the other intersecting socio-economic and political issues facing the country and the region.
My article in this anthology forms the ultimate chapter of the reissued edition of my book, Philippine Gay Culture. I wrote it as an update on the empirical survey of Philippine gay cultural events and foundational concepts from the original work, and also as a way to resituate this work's significance from within a decolonial frame. When the UP Press decided to reissue this book as part of its UP Centennial titles, I decided that in the new edition I would need to put together a more self-consciously post-colonial approach to the study of Philippine gender and sexuality, as focalized around the issues and questions of Filipino gay subjectivity. What emerged in this engagement with my old work was my theorizing of what I am now inclined to call a critical nationalist perspective.
Roselle Pineda's essay complements Garcia's. Her historical analysis of the development lesbian identities and their social and political struggles in the country provides a framework to more thoroughly appreciate the other studies in the book. With the increasing recognition of diverse sexual and gender identities, the question inevitably turns to how such identities are included and incorporated within Philippine society.
I am Roselle Pineda. I teach at the Department of Art Studies in UP Diliman, University of the Philippines, Diliman, for many years now, and had been an advocate for the LGBT since the 90s. The article is about the lesbian struggle, specifically the lesbian struggle in the Philippines. I had a lot of contention when I wrote that because I didn't call it a movement. I called it a struggle. So, pakikibaka, pero hindi pa siya kilusan. Ganun yung parang distinction. Dahil in order for a movement to be a movement, there has to be a wide mass base. And at the time, while there were many lesbians, LGBT people in all members, in all social strata, the organizing is yet to spread in all these different social strata.
To understand the present situation, it is useful to study the past. The Philippines' history as a colonial possession of two different Western powers, Spain and America, has shaped and altered the gender and sexual relations of its indigenous society in striking ways. In pre-colonial society, the power to perform religious rituals and commune with spirits was associated with women in the person of the bailan, or priestess. However, there were also men who wielded the spiritual authority while wearing feminine clothing and also behaving femininely according to those society's norms. Caroline Brewer argues that For these shamans, it was being identified with the feminine that gave them their respected status and connection with the spirit world. In these Southeast Asian societies, sexual identity was not linked to biology, but rather to gender. Raquel Reyes's essay shows us how notions of gender and sexuality differed among Spanish colonizers, Philippine natives, and Chinese immigrants, as illustrated by the cultural conflict that took place between the Spanish colonizers and the Chinese community in Manila over the case of Lu Su, a Chinese Mandarin from Taiwan who was charged with acts of sodomy.
My case study involves Lu Su, a Chinese high-ranking official from Taiwan who was a frequent visitor to Manila's Parian, the enclave designated by Spanish colonial authorities for Chinese settler communities. In 1670, the Real Audiencia, the colony's appellate court, found Lu Su guilty of sodomy and condemned him to death. The records are not explicit about Lu Su's transgressive activities, although they imply that he enjoyed sodomitical activities with Chinese males residing in the Parian and had one favorite in particular. There are no details on Lu Su's intimates, but their anonymity in the records suggests that they were social inferiors and young. My sources include letters from Pang Sabuan, petitions from non-Christian Chinese who lived in the Parian, and reports from a Spanish friar who advised Spanish authorities of Chinese reactions in the Parian. I undertook the research in the Spanish archives of Seville, and Lu Su's case is the first earliest documented instance yet located of a male-male sexual relationship in the Philippines in its transnational and local contexts.
Joaine Marquez follows this subject as well by looking not only at the behavior of individuals like Lu Su, but also at the gender and sexual practices in Imperial China at the time, as well as the context of Spanish institutional responses toward the practice of sodomy in the Chinese community. This social and transnational history documents the agency of the Chinese and how ideas were translated across cultures and nations.
I'm Joaine Marquez, and I currently teach history in Japan. I'm a high school teacher. I live in Yokohama. I've been in Yokohama for 9 months already. And my article is entitled Pecado Nefando and the Chinese in Early Spanish Philippines, Hispano-Asian Encounters and Ethnosexual Discourses. My article is all about how the Chinese in Spanish Philippines were targeted for sodomy prosecutions. I'm not the first one to write about such, nor am I the only contributor who wrote about it in the anthology. So what I simply tried to do in the article was to show how the broad political and social context is important in understanding how Spain treated the question of sodomy in its colonies like the Philippines, and how it clashed with the understanding of the Chinese immigrants given their social context in the late Ming and Qing dynasty.
This set of essays focus on how individuals see themselves and how they describe and identify themselves to society in terms of sexual or gender identities. What do Filipino terms like bakla or tomboy actually mean to the people who use them? And how do they relate with terms like gay and lesbian? How are English language terms appropriated and redefined by members of the LGBTQIA+ community in the Philippines? In his essay, Michael Tan points out that the term bakla was originally used to connote effeminacy rather than sexual orientation. It was after English terms like homosexual and gay were introduced into the Philippine vocabulary and used interchangeably with bakla that the latter term began to be associated also with sexual identity and practice. In Tan's study, many of the men he surveyed, mostly educated middle to upper class and below 30, chose to use the term gay instead of bakla to identify themselves, associating the latter term with effeminacy as well as with lower socioeconomic classes.
From Bakla to Gay, Shifting Gender Identities and Sexual Behaviors in the Philippines by Michael Tan. In his essay, From Bakla to Gay, Shifting Gender Identities and Sexual Behaviors in the Philippines, Michael Tan points out that bakla, unlike gay, was originally a term that connotes effeminacy and not sexual orientation. In other words, it was linked with a gender identity. When the term homosexual was introduced into the Philippine lexicon and then used interchangeably with bakla, the latter term bakla began to be associated also with sexual identity and practice. But even with such association, the term bakla continues to be identified with effeminacy. Hence, even the word bisexual is not used as a sexual identity, but as a gendered identity. Bisexuals in the Philippine context are popularly believed to be closeted baklas, that is, men who act or believe themselves to be heterosexual but are secretly otherwise.
This bias against being seen as effeminate is further manifested among Filipino men seeking other men on online dating websites. In his essay, Ronald Baitan studies how many of these men steer clear of the term gay and choose to identify themselves as bi, despite being attracted only to men. Thus, the word bisexual is used differently from how it is in the Western world, not as a sexual identity, but as a gendered identity connoting masculinity. While tracing the development of tomboy, lesbian, and transgender communities in the country, Jennifer Joseph points out the distinct ways that such identities are perceived locally. In the Philippines, the term lesbian is often used by or associated with those from a middle-class background, while tomboy is more often associated with those from the working class or the urban poor, similar to bakla. The recognition of trans men further complicates the question of how the Pinoy tomboy relates to Western-based identities.
I met JJ in the Philippines, my first trip there in 2003, and she had just published a master's thesis on how lesbians came out, sort of how lesbians were discriminated in the women's movement in the Philippines, and how they had to fight to be accepted as lesbians, even in a progressive movement like feminism in the Philippines. And I called upon her to write, to kind of update the master's thesis and show how transgender people in the Philippines had to fight for acceptance in the women's movement, in the feminist movement, over a 30-year period, and are now accepted members of that movement.
I think even tomboy or bakla can have local reverberations, and there are issues of power, language, and access and equity. So even in bakla, those are not perfect translations, or they don't apply to every ethno-linguistic group.
With a broad picture of what it means to be an LGBTIQA+ person in Philippine society today, the next set of essays examine how Filipinos challenge the limitations imposed on them by heterocentric cultural institutions and gender norms, as well as global economic forces. Several essays delve into the unique experiences of LGBTIQA+ outside of the urban and Metro Manila-centered context. In Aklan, the term for gay is agi, which is similar to but distinct from the term bakla, as Patrick Acedo writes. One self-identified agi, known as Thai August, has become a part of the local Ati-Atihan Festival in Kalibo, Aklan for many years. Thai August's participation is seen as a panaad or penitential act to please the Santo Niño. This is an example of how LGBTIQA+ individuals negotiate societal and religious norms, allowing them to express their sexual and gender identity in ways that may seem transgressive but still fit within the boundaries of church norms in ways that make sense to the people involved.
So it's focused on my former ballet teacher, Augusto Johnson, and he transforms himself as a fully bergère chorus girl during the Ati-Atihan Festival. So anyway, he was a very, very close friend of ours. And so I thought that as an icon of the Ati-Atihan Festival, I should write a chapter about him. So his participation in the Ati-Atihan Festival as an act of faith was a dissertation chapter, and I turned it into an article. And the title became Sacred Camp, using Susan Sontag's formulation of it. And I argue that through a performance such as his, one could really dehomogenize the way that we practice Catholicism, and how could the Agi or the Bakla participate in the practice of Roman Catholic faith.
Kyra Albero's study examines the attitude toward same-sex love among the members of a radical movement. The Communist Party of the Philippines in 1998 recognized same-gender relationships among its ranks, leading up to the first same-sex marriage ceremony between two members of the New People's Army, or NPA, in 2005. Nevertheless, heteronormativity and traditional concepts of masculinity are still prevalent, influencing how these revolutionary cadres view sexuality and gender relations. Over recent decades, the lives of LGBTIQA+ individuals, along with other Filipinos, have been greatly affected by forces of globalization. The push by industrialized countries like the US, along with Philippine government policies over the decades, have created a massive human expert economy in the Philippines. A large portion of this overseas labor market consists of Filipinos working as seamen. Kale Fajardo writes about his interactions with these Filipino seamen and how he was perceived by them as a trans man over 8 months spent on a container ship. Fajardo argues that Filipino masculinities, heterosexual male and tomboy, must be understood in relation to, not apart from, each other.
I got involved with this book project when Professor Richard Chu of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst invited me to participate. I believe he requested that particular article because it apparently is seen as a foundational essay in trans Filipinx studies. There aren't a lot of articles or books on tomboys. There are some, dissertations or shorter pieces, but at the time when that article was first published in GLQ, which stands for the Gay and Lesbian Studies Quarterly, and that was in a special issue on the intersection of queer and migration. So that was published in 2008. Sir Richard asked me if he could reprint it, and I was honored to be able to participate in that way. The article has also been reprinted in the Transgender Studies Quarterly.
But not all Filipino men were able to find work abroad as seamen or construction workers. During the 1970s, the rise of gay bars led to gay identities becoming associated with commercialized sexual exchange, as so-called macho dancers earned their living by displaying their bodies for the eyes of gay men or straight women. This was part of what Rolando Tolentino describes as the feminization of Filipino male labor and the reconfiguration of Filipino masculinities.
My essay is on macho dancing, and the feminization of labor, as it is tied up to a kind of commercial sex that is also linked uh, to the intensification of global neoliberalism. I talk about the two generation of macho dancing um, that takes place in the gay bar. No, it is a unique kind of Philippine expression of sexuality, perception of masculinity in the ways the macho dancers and the guests have aligned a kind of masculinity that is enforced and commercially acceptable in the workplace of the gay bar.
In the last part of the book, struggles for justice and recognition in larger society are expressed in terms of individual experience, identity, and relationships, calling to mind the progressivist motto, "The personal is political." Richard T. Chu's essay takes an autobiographical approach, using his own life experience to explore a topic that has rarely been studied: the intersection of sexual identities with religious and ethnic identities among diasporic Chinese. As he does so, Chu paves the way conceptually for discussing the challenges of an LGBT-inclusive Philippine psychology.
I wrote growing up male Chinese and Catholic in the Philippines, and the son my mother wanted me to be, as a way to also understand myself. Um, because I grew up with different identities. You know, I'm Chinese, but I'm also Filipino. I'm gay, I'm male, I'm Christian or Catholic, but also Buddhist. So writing this piece helped me to understand myself better, how my different identities intersect with one another, and how they all form who I am. But at the same time, I wanted other people who are in similar situation to learn from my own experiences. I think there is again a lack of openness and willingness to discuss sexuality uh, within my own community. You know, for example, the Chinoy or the Filipino Chinese community in the Philippines. The topic of gender and sexual identities is often, if I mean, is not talked about. So I hope by writing this essay, it will engender not only interest but also a sustained commitment and dialogue or discussion about gender and sexual identities, not only within the Chinese Filipino community, but also within the broader society.
Eric Julian Manalastas and Beatriz Torre tackle this in their essay, exploring how the psychological profession in the Philippines has sought to address LGBT-specific issues over the years, including the landmark statement of the Psychological Association of the Philippines on non-discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, released in 2011.
Hi, I'm Beatriz Torre, or Bea for short. I'm currently an assistant professor at the UP Diliman Department of Psychology, and I am also the current chairperson of the Psychological Association of the Philippines LGBT Psychology Special Interest Group. The article that Eric and I co-wrote, entitled LGBT Psychology in the Philippines, is kind of like a story of how we and some of our colleagues came together to try to use psychology, organized psychology, within the PAP, the Psychological Association of the Philippines, as a platform to push for the rights and well-being of LGBT Filipinos. So it talks about this article talks about some of the critical events, mostly involving Filipino psychologists in national media in some form or another, na nag-spur ng discussion kind of galvanized us to come together to form a group that would take a more active role in using psychology to promote LGBT rights and well-being, and also developing the capacity of our fellow psychologists, of mental health professionals, to do the same thing, not to do research, teaching, advocacy work, and psychological practice in ways that are LGBT affirmative. Yeah. So, and we in this article we also discuss some of the insights that we've learned from our experiences, and some of the the conditions or the factors that help us achieve kung ano man yung na-achieve namin na kahit pa paano meron kaming konting gains that we have made. So we also talk about the factors that helped us to do that.
In the context of the political gains and obstacles of LGBTIQA+ people in the Philippines and the region, Mira Ofreneo explains the scope and methods of psychological science in order to present an outline for a distinctive theory and practice of Philippine LGBT psychology. In the context of the political gains and obstacles of LGBTIQA+ people in the Philippines and the region, Mira Ofreneo explains the scope and methods of psychological science in order to present an outline for a distinctive theory and practice of Philippine LGBT psychology, one that is guided by ethical standards and informed by psychological studies of LGBT populations, as well as international standards of human health and well-being.
The last chapter in the book is by Mira Ofreneo. So this is really an essay on how to think about psychology as an academic discipline that helps people create social change, to better their own standard of living, to better their own well-being, both economic and psychological and spiritual, using psychology. And we have it's the last essay to the book because it creates a view of a better society and the role of the personal in relation to the political in creating a better society, using the tools of psychology, the academic discipline of psychology, understand scholarly essays in the Philippines.
While heteronormative values and institutions continue to be prevalent in the Philippines and to have undeniable impact, LGBTIQA+ Filipinos nonetheless manage to carve out spaces to express, define, and exist as themselves within society. Ultimately, it would be impossible for even the most exhaustively compiled anthology to cover every topic worth examining under Philippine LGBT studies. Many areas not brought up by the essays in this book would be ideal subjects for further study. The picture of the Pinoy LGBT experience is never complete, because it is always growing in richness and complexity as part of the shifting multichromatic canvas of Philippine history and the Filipino experience.